I was thinking the other day, the Irish wake is well known across the world for its joviality. Sure, the only person who isn't smiling at the wake is the guest of honour. The only one who doesn't get into a fight at an Irish wake is usually the guest of honour as well. But I was thinking of one particular wake for a fella, Bengie Kelly. Now, I remember Bengie, and most of his friends remember him well, as a man who loved to dance. Sure, you'd go to a wake or a wedding, there would be Bengie Kelly dancing his feet off. A grand fella entirely. But Bengie passed on very suddenly, like the one day. His missus sent out the word to the neighbours to gather for the wake. She went through the trouble of the fixings, and then she went in and laid out Bengie. There he was lying on the table, very quiet. And as she was finished with that, she went in, she put on her widow's weeds and came back out and sat there, awaiting the arrival of the neighbours. And everything was very quiet, except for a little crickly-crackly sound you would hear as Bengie would be drying out in the heat. And she sat there thinking to herself, "Ah, Bengie," says she, "this is one wake you'll not be dancing at." But she forgot to say, "God rest you." She sat there waiting the neighbours, and the crickly-crackly as Bengie dried out in the heat kept on. The only sound beside that was the hissing of the turf fire. Gradually the neighbours began to arrive, and as they came in, they gathered around. But Bengie sat up in the middle of it, and he walked over to his missus and sat down beside her. And as he moved, you could hear the crickly-crackly sound, for he was still drying out in the heat. "Look at you, woman," says he. "What are you all dolled up for?" "It's for a wake." "And whose wake would that be?" says Bengie. "Why, yours." "That is peculiar," says Bengie, "for I don't feel very dead. And I'm not getting back up on that table until I'm feeling dead. And there's an end of it." And he sat down beside her, crossed his arms, and put a pout in his face. And the neighbours were all astounded. Well, what could you say to a man who was that obstinate? For it was well known Bengie would not change his mind very easily. Everyone sat there in silence, embarrassed and otherwise, and the only sound that you could still hear was the hissing of the turf fire and the little crickly-crackly as Bengie kept on drying out in the heat. Oh, and when Father Stanton arrived for the rosary, there was hell to pay. He refused to say the prayers of the dead over a man who was sitting there with a puss on him. Everyone sat there quietly still, not a word could they think of to say for embarrassment among other reasons. And the only sound was that crickly-crackly of Bengie drying out in the heat. This could have spent the whole night this way, if it wasn't for Teddy Dillon, the fiddle player, arriving. He took in the whole situation in one glance, and he knew just what to do. He took off his bonine jacket, got out his fiddle, rosined his bow, and began a lively set of reels. And sure, didn't Bengie's toe begin to tap? And then his foot began to tap. And finally his knee was bouncing up and down to the rhythm, and eventually Bengie jumped up out of his chair and began dancing along to the music. He was kicking away and flailing, and as he was kicking and dancing and flailing, didn't a finger fly off of his hand in the one direction, and a foot went skippering off down the floor in the other direction. Didn't it stop right in front of Widow O'Toole? Ah, be Jays, she was in a fit. And he danced back and forth, an arm went flying this way, an elbow went flying that way, another hand went flying off. God, it's a grand thing he only had two hands to fling off, until finally, after all of this jumping and skipping about, in the heat of the hunt, there was Bengie's head sitting on top of a pile of his bones. "You know," says Bengie, I'm feeling a bit knackered. I think I'll take that lie down after all. And that was the wake for Bengie Kelly.